Welcome back to Literary Leap. Today we are leaping into Act 4, Scene 3 of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, a fiery confrontation inside Brutus's tent. Accusations fly, tempers flare, and friendships are tested. What happens when honor clashes with loyalty and ideals are pushed to their breaking point? So let's unpack the tension and explore the brilliance of this iconic scene. Now, Brutus and Cassius, once allies in the conspiracy, are now experiencing strained relations due to differences in values and actions. Keep in mind, in Roman times, concepts like honor, loyalty, and integrity were highly esteemed. Accusations like taking bribes would be considered disgraceful. Cassius accuses Brutus of wronging him by condemning Lucius Pella, one of Cassius's associates, for taking bribes. Now, condemned and noted means Brutus had publicly shamed Lucius Pella, tarnishing his reputation. Now, bribery and corruption were common issues in Roman governance, just like every other government. But Brutus, as a man of honor, couldn't tolerate it even from allies or friends. And here we see Cassius's tone is accusatory and defensive, and it sets the stage for the conflict. Prior to this, Cassius had written letters to Brutus pleading for Lucius Pella's pardon. However, Brutus ignored them, which Cassius, of course, interprets as an insult. Slighted off over here means Brutus dismissed Cassius's intercession without respect. So, this shows the ideological rift. Cassius gives priority to loyalty and friends, while Brutus values justice over personal connections. Now, hearing Cassius's accusations, Brutus, of course, could not control himself, so he retorts sharply, saying that Cassius was wrong to advocate for someone guilty of corruption. So, Brutus, he emphasizes his commitment to justice, reinforcing his stoic Roman virtues. And we see he's firm and judgmental, highlighting his moral superiority. So now we see Cassius argues that during these chaotic and dangerous times, it's impractical to punish every small offense. Nice offense refers to minor or trivial faults. Cassius is like essentially saying that Brutus is being overly strict, that at these dangerous times, Brutus should be a little lenient and not consider every little offense to be grave or something that needs to be punished. So here we see Cassius represents a more pragmatic approach, that means a more logical or practical approach to politics, contrasting with Brutus's idealism. Now, what we get to see here is Brutus accuses Cassius of being greedy, of having an itching palm, and selling political positions or offices or positions of power to undeserving people for money. Now, itching palm is a metaphor which symbolizes greed. Cell and mart are imagery depicting a marketplace, suggesting corruption. Brutus draws this image that Cassius must be auctioning off these places of positions or offices or positions of power to undeserving people, like he auctions it off to the highest bidder. And Brutus condemns Cassius for prioritizing wealth over honor, aligning with the Roman ideals of virtue. Cassius, of course, is outraged and denies the accusation. He goes on to remind Brutus of his authority and reputation, implying that anyone else who dared accuse him would face dire consequences. And the phrase by the gods, it is a way
of
Cassius,
showing
of course,
an
is
oath
outraged and denies
of
the
showing how
accusation,
the
and he
Romans
reminds Brutus
invoked their
of his
deities
authority
to
and
emphasize
reputation,
sincerity
implying
or
that
threat.
anyone
So the
else
tone
who
over
dared
here
accuse
is
him
of
would face
threatening
dire
and deeply
consequences.
offended.
By the
So it
gods,
shows
this is a
Cassius's
phrase which
pride
is like
and
an
quick
oath,
temper.
showing how
The
Romans
Romans
valued
invoked
their
honor,
deities
justice, and
to
stoic
emphasize
self-control.
sincerity or
Losing temper or
threats.
choler or
Now we
engaging in
see
corruption was
Cassius
seen as a
has a
sign of
threatening and
weakness or dishonor. So
deeply
this tension
offended
reflects
tone,
their
and it
struggle to
reveals
live up to
Cassius's
these
pride
ideals.
and quick temper.
Brutus
So we
accuses
see that the
Cassius of
Romans
using
valued
his
honor,
reputation or
justice,
his
and
name
stoic
to
self
shield
control.
corruption.
Losing temper or
Chastisement or
engaging in
punishment
corruption was
is
seen
hidden
as a
because
sign of
Cassius's
weakness or
influence
dishonor.
prevents
So the
accountability.
tension reflects
Brutus
their or
values
this tension
justice
reflects
above
their
loyalty,
struggle to live
showing
up to
his
their
rigid
ideals.
idealism.
In
Now,
spite of
Cassius
Cassius's
is totally
threatening tone,
shocked and outraged by
Brutus
the
isn't threatened
accusation.
by him, and he further
Chastisement, the
continues to
single word
accuse Cassius
emphasizes
of
his
using his
disbelief and
reputation
anger.
or his
The
name
tone here
to
is
shield
defensive,
corruption.
signaling that the
Chastisement,
conflict
that is
is now
punishment, is,
escalating.
according to Brutus, hidden because Cassius's influence prevents accountability. So we see Brutus values justice above loyalty, showing his rigid idealism. Now, hearing this, of course, Cassius loses it. He kind of, screams out chastisement. Cassius is shocked and outraged by the accusation. So, this single word emphasizes his disbelief and anger. And we see Cassius, he has a very defensive tone, which signals that the conflict is now starting to escalate. Now, Brutus goes on to remind Cassius of their shared purpose during Caesar's assassination to uphold justice. He questions if Cassius has forgotten their noble motives. Keep in mind the Ides of March, that is March 15. It is the day when Caesar was killed, which marked a turning point in Roman history. Brutus argues that every conspirator, including Cassius himself, claimed to act for justice when they killed Caesar. So, right now, when he calls Cassius a villain, it indirectly implies betrayal of their cause. Brutus criticizes Cassius for accepting bribes, asking how they, who killed Caesar for justice, could now engage in corruption. Brutus uses the phrase foremost man of all this world. It is a hyperbolic reference to Caesar's greatness. Contaminate our fingers is a metaphor for dishonoring themselves through immoral actions. Now, Brutus views bribery as degrading, likening the money gained to trash, that is, worthless things or garbage. According to him, honor is vast and noble, while bribery reduces it to mere trash. And then he refers to the grandeur of their reputation by using the phrase large honors, which he feels is now being tarnished because of the corruption that Cassius has gotten himself into. Brutus would rather live a debased existence. Like that means a dog howling at the moon. He gives the example of a dog howling at the moon than compromise his moral values as a Roman. So Brutus compares himself to a dog to highlight his disdain for dishonor. Now, this is a simile. And disdain for dishonor means his hatred or his repulsion for dishonor. And he uses the symbolism of the moon to represent unattainable ideals, while baying, that means symbolizes futile actions. So we see Brutus is very strong regarding his ideals, and for him, being corrupt is absolutely dishonorable. Now, anyone in Cassius's place would be absolutely angered when accused the way Brutus is accusing him. So, naturally, Cassius defends himself, demanding respect as a seasoned soldier with more experience, and he resents being lectured by Brutus. Hedge me in is a phrase which he uses in order to show how Brutus is restricting or undermining him. Hedge me in is a metaphor. And we see that Cassius's tone is very proud and defiant, which highlights Cassius's ego. Now, Brutus is not one to step back. Brutus outright denies Cassius's claim of superiority, intensifying the argument. So Cassius wants Brutus not to provoke him further, implying that he might lose control of his temper. The phrase, have mind upon your health, is nothing but a subtle threat. So Cassius's pride clashes with Brutus's sense of moral authority. Now, Brutus, as I said, is not someone to back down easily. He goes on to dismiss Cassius as insignificant. He uses the word slight in order to show that he considers Cassius's threat as insignificant, or Cassius himself as insignificant, showing his anger and his disdain. So, seeing this, Cassius expresses disbelief at Brutus's dismissiveness. Like, this is not something which Cassius is used to. This is not the kind of behavior which he has seen from Brutus towards him. So, Brutus refuses to back down and criticizes Cassius's anger or his choler, comparing him to a madman. Must I give way and room to your rash choler? This is a rhetorical question, and it emphasizes Brutus's defiance and mock Cassius's behavior. So Cassius calls upon the gods, expressing frustration and disbelief at Brutus's insults. So now Cassius has become desperate and he's exasperated, and he wants to prove to Brutus that whatever he is telling him or accusing him of is absolutely rubbish or is very, very wrong. Now, Brutus mocks Cassius further, telling him to direct his anger at his subordinates or his slaves. And the phrase, fret till your proud heart break, is a hyperbolic statement that Cassius's pride will lead to his ruin. Now, Brutus refuses to tolerate Cassius's temperamental behavior or his testy humor. Brutus declares that Cassius must control his anger or venom of your spleen, even if it destroys him. So, venom of your spleen here is a metaphor which symbolizes poisonous rage. And Brutus sarcastically says he'll laugh at Cassius whenever he behaves like an angry wasp. So now he's not only mocking Cassius, but he's also being dismissive. Now, Cassius is shocked and hurt by the extent of their argument. This line reflects, that is it come to this? This line reflects his disbelief at how much their friendship has deteriorated. So he sounds sorrowful and frustrated, showing his emotional vulnerability. Brutus, of course, mocks Cassius, challenging him to prove his claim and being a better soldier. He sarcastically adds that he would be glad to learn from someone noble, indirectly questioning Cassius's nobility. So, the figures of speech that we see that have been used over here are sarcasm. The entire speech is actually dripping with mockery, highlighting Brutus's anger. And we also see irony being used because Brutus uses the idea of learning from Cassius to insult him, not with a desire to actually learn, but it was more like leading to an insult. So Cassius, of course, defends himself, clarifying that he only claimed to be more experienced or, elderly, not superior. He feels repeatedly misjudged and insulted by Brutus. So Cassius tries to actually de escalate the argument by pointing out Brutus's misunderstanding. Brutus, however, dismisses Cassius's explanation entirely, showing his indifference to Cassius's feelings. He's entirely, angered by the fact that Cassius has stooped to being so corrupt, and he's showing every possible way to show his indifference towards Cassius's feelings. Now, Cassius asserts that when Caesar was alive, no one, including Brutus, would have dared to challenge or provoke him in this way. So, Cassius is basically highlighting his past influence and stature, contrasting it with his current vulnerability. Brutus counters by saying Cassius lacked the courage to provoke Caesar. This comment is a direct insult to Cassius's bravery. Cassius is, of course, offended and he is incredulous, repeating Brutus's accusations to emphasize the insult. Brutus, of course, doubles down, accusing Cassius of being too fearful to act boldly against Caesar when he was alive. Now, this was too much for Cassius, and so Cassius warns Brutus not to test his patience, implying that he might lash out and later regret his actions. So, this is basically a mix of warning and pleading, showing Cassius's struggle between anger and affection. Brutus coldly retorts that Cassius had already committed actions worthy of regret. And this refers to the alleged denial of gold and possibly Cassius's perceived corruption. Brutus also dismisses Cassius's threats, claiming his honesty protects him. The threats are meaningless to him, like an idle wind that blows without consequence. So Cassius's threats are compared to the idle wind, emphasizing their insignificance. And Brutus uses armor as a metaphor for honesty, symbolizing his moral superiority. Brutus then accuses Cassius of denying him money to pay his soldiers, a crucial betrayal in Brutus's eyes. He explains that he refuses to obtain money through dishonest means. He'd rather metaphorically coin his heart and sacrifice his own blood than extort peasants. Coin my heart is a metaphor, and drop my blood for drachmas emphasizes Brutus's integrity and self-sacrifice. Now, Brutus questions if Cassius's refusal aligns with the behavior of a loyal friend, further emphasizing his disappointment. He declares he would never become greedy or dishonest. If he ever did, he asked the gods to punish him with thunderbolts. So, this again reflects Roman beliefs in divine justice. Now, Cassius insists he did not refuse the gold, attempting to defend his honor. He wants to let Brutus know that when Brutus had asked for money, Cassius had not refused the gold. Brutus, of course, bluntly contradicts him, leaving no room for discussion. So Cassius claims the misunderstanding was due to a messenger's incompetence. He confesses that Brutus's harsh words have indeed broken his heart, rived my heart. So, rived my heart conveys deep emotional pain. Cassius believes true friends should overlook each other's flaws, but Brutus goes on to magnify his. Now, Brutus denies exaggerating Cassius's faults, claiming he only reacts when Cassius's flaws directly harm him. To this, Cassius laments that Brutus's criticism shows a lack of affection. Brutus then clarifies that his disapproval is of Cassius's actions, not his person. Brutus wants to clarify to Cassius that he does not hate Cassius or he does not dislike Cassius. It is his actions, his behavior that has prompted him to dislike the actions and not the person. So Cassius argues that a true friend would overlook his flaws, suggesting Brutus is being overly critical. Brutus now counters that only a flatterer, not a true friend, would ignore faults as massive as Cassius's. So we see that comparing Cassius's faults to the height of Mount Olympus emphasizes their severity. So this is, of course, a hyperbole. And we must remember that Olympus, it was the home of gods and it reflects Roman familiarity with Greek mythology. So Cassius, overwhelmed by the argument, emotionally invites Antony and Octavius to take revenge on him, expressing his weariness of life. Cassius feels unvalued and defeated, highlighting his vulnerability. So we see that the weight of betrayal and personal loss is shown or highlighted over here. Cassius laments that he is criticized and hated by Brutus, whom he loves. He feels as though Brutus catalogs all his faults and throws them back at him. Checked like a bondman. This is a simile and it compares Cassius to a slave being reprimanded, emphasizing his humiliation. And we see the use of set in a notebook. It is a figure of speech that is an imagery which paints a vivid picture of meticulous criticism. So Cassius feels extremely heartbroken that he wishes he could weep out his soul. Of course, this is an exaggeration of his grief. Cassius offers his dagger and exposes his chest, inviting Brutus to kill him if he finds him so dishonorable. He claims his heart is more precious than the treasures of Plutus, the Roman god of wealth. So we see that Cassius, his heart symbolizes his loyalty and worth. He uses the metaphor of heart to symbolize his loyalty and worth. Cassius challenges Brutus's Roman honor, urging him to strike if he feels fit as a true Roman would. So we see the Romans prided themselves on courage and honor. And Cassius accuses Brutus of having loved Caesar more than he loves Cassius, even at the height of their conspiracy. So this line reflects Cassius's jealousy and, of course, his emotional pain. Now, seeing Cassius bare his chest and asking Brutus to strike him, Brutus tells Cassius to put away his dagger and vent his anger as he pleases. He dismissively says he'll treat Cassius's dishonorable behavior as a mere quirk. Quirk means a peculiar trait, or he will treat it as humor. And Brutus compares himself to a lamb, which is gentle by nature, and his anger to a flint, which only produces a brief spark under pressure but quickly subsides. So we see carries anger as a flint bears fire. This is a simile and it conveys the fleeting nature of Brutus's anger. And yoked with a lamb is a metaphor which symbolizes Brutus's perceived patience and mildness. Cassius is insulted that Brutus now sees him as a source of amusement despite his inner turmoil. Brutus, of course, admits he was also overcome by emotion during their argument, showing his willingness to reconcile. Cassius now is touched by Brutus's admission and extends his hand in friendship. Brutus responds with a gesture of reconciliation, offering not just his hand but his heart, symbolizing his emotional connection. Cassius, relieved but still emotional, seeks reassurance from Brutus. Cassius attributes his temper to his mother, asking Brutus for patience in understanding his flaws. Rash humor over here is a personification and is used to describe an inherited trait from his mother. So Brutus humorously agrees to forgive Cassius's outbursts, comparing them to a scolding mother. So this kind of is used to lighten the mood. And now we see a poet barges in, interrupting the private moment between the generals to counsel them about love and friendship. The poet comes to kind of, explain to both of them, like, y'all are friends, y'all need to show love and friendship to each other. The poet acts as a moral commentator, urging Brutus and Cassius to reconcile and live up to their great reputation. Now, this interruption is, of course, absolutely not appreciated by Brutus, and Brutus dismisses the poet, annoyed by the untimely interruption. On the other hand, Cassius, amused, defends the poet's behavior as typical of his personality. Brutus then questions the relevance of frivolous poets in serious matters like war. He uses the rhetorical question, what should the wars do with these jigging fools, in order to emphasize the poet's irrelevance. Now we see Brutus reveals Portia's death. Brutus finally confesses his grief over Portia's death, and we see Brutus confirming the death of his wife Portia, but with a tone of controlled emotion. This is reflective of Roman stoicism or emotional restraint, even in the face of personal loss. Now, Cassius is absolutely shocked, reflecting on how Brutus managed to restrain himself during their earlier argument, even in the face of such grief. He describes the loss as insupportable, highlighting its emotional weight. So, "Oh, insupportable and touching loss" conveys his deep sympathy and shock. Brutus explains that Portia, distressed by his absence and the political turmoil, succumbed to grief when she heard of Octavius and Antony's growing power. The mention of Antony and Octavius reflects the threat they pose to Brutus and Cassius, who are preparing for war. Now, Portia's suicide by swallowing hot coal reflects her desperation and courage. Romans admired such acts as displays of strength and resolve. Euphemism is used over here where we see the phrase fell distract. It softens the harsh reality of her losing her sanity, and swallowed fire evokes a vivid and tragic picture. So we need to note that suicide was often seen as an honorable escape in Roman culture, especially for women of high status. Cassius's brief question emphasizes his shock and disbelief when he says, "and died so." So, this is his disbelief, his shock. And this question, it emphasizes all of this. Brutus confirms with brevity a reflection of his stoic acceptance of her death. He does not go ahead and explain further, he just confirms it. And Cassius calls upon the Roman gods, a common expression of despair or appeal for strength. Romans, again, as I mentioned prior to this, often evoked their gods during moments of great emotional turmoil. Cassius still finds it hard to believe that Portia is dead, and Brutus is able to control his emotions so well. We do know that Brutus loved Portia very much, and he did not want to keep talking about her death anymore. So he requests wine to distract himself from grief, symbolizing his decision to focus on their alliance. By saying he buries all unkindness, he extends forgiveness to Cassius for their earlier quarrel. So, bury all unkindness equates drinking wine with putting their conflict to rest. Now, Cassius, touched by Brutus's reconciliation, uses the metaphor of his thirst for love to express his gratitude and affection. My heart is thirsty, links his emotional longing to physical thirst. And I cannot drink too much. This is his exaggeration regarding his appreciation about Brutus's desire to reconcile. Brutus shifts the focus to strategy, indicating his preference for action over lingering on emotions. And then we see Messala coming in. Now, Messala reports that Antony, Octavius, and Lepidus have executed 100 senators through proscription, a practice of publicly naming enemies of the state to be killed, as I had mentioned previously. Now, Brutus notes a discrepancy in the number of senators reported dead. He highlights the death of Cicero, a respected Roman orator, adding to the tragedy. Now, Cassius expresses shock at the death of Cicero, expressing the growing power and ruthlessness of their enemies. Messala inquires about news of Portia, sensing Brutus's loss. And Brutus avoids discussing Portia's death, showing his effort to maintain composure. Messala, of course, invoking Roman ideals of Stoicism, confirms Portia's death with reluctance. So now Brutus bids a composed farewell to Portia, accepting death as inevitable. He shows like he accepts it in such a way that it reflects Roman philosophy, which valued rational endurance over emotional display. Messala praises Brutus for his strength, reinforcing the Roman values of dignity in grief. Cassius, on the other hand, admits he understands the principles of Stoicism but lacks Brutus's ability to control his emotions. Brutus now shifts focus to their military strategy, emphasizing action over dwelling on grief. Brutus now puts forward the question to the other two, as in what they think of marching to Philippi. Now, Cassius argues that it's strategically smarter to let the enemy come to them rather than march to Philippi. This, he reasons, saying that this would exhaust their enemies while keeping their own troops rested and agile. Brutus acknowledges Cassius's logic but insists that his own argument is stronger and should take precedence. So Brutus explains that the local people between their camp and Philippi support them only out of necessity, not loyalty. They resent being taxed. So this reflects the wavering public support for Brutus and Cassius after Caesar's death. So Brutus warns that if the enemy marches through these lands, they might recruit more supporters, strengthening their forces. But by marching to Philippi, Brutus believes they can prevent the enemy from gaining reinforcement and ensure there are no hostile forces behind them. Cassius politely requests to present his argument again, showing deference to Brutus despite his disagreement. Brutus argues that their enemy is at its peak strength and their cause is ready for action. Waiting would only weaken their advantage. So, our legions are brimful. This is a metaphor which likens their troops to a container filled to capacity. Brutus explains their forces will weaken over time while the enemy's strength grows daily. Brutus uses this metaphor to compare life's opportunities to a tide. There is a tide in the affairs of men. This is the metaphor which he uses to compare life's opportunity to a tide. Seizing the tide at its peak leads to success. Missing it results in failure and regret. So Brutus likens their situation to a boat on a high tide. He insists that they must act decisively now or risk losing everything. Cassius, though reluctant, defers to Brutus's decision, showing respect and unity. Brutus now notes it is late and that they must sleep or they must rest. The phrase nature must obey necessity refers to the human need for sleep. Personification is also used over here. The deep of night is crept. So, this is a personification which gives human like qualities to the night time. Cassius bids Brutus good night, agreeing to set off early the next morning. Cassius also refers to their earlier quarrel and argument and asks Brutus to ensure no such discord ever arise between them. Brutus, of course, reassures Cassius that all is fine, emphasizing their restored unity. Now, Brutus asks his servant Lucius, who is clearly tired, to play music for him. He does not order, he requests Lucius. He can see that Lucius is extremely tired and sleepy, but he goes on to request that Lucius play a few notes for him. Lucius humbly responds, showing his devotion to Brutus. And Brutus acknowledges that he is demanding too much of his young servant, but appreciates Lucius's willingness to serve. Lucius, of course, expresses his sense of duty and he agrees to go ahead and play a note or two for Brutus. Brutus shows kindness and consideration for Lucius, recognizing that the young need rest. The phrase young bloods refers to youthful energy. Lucius assures Brutus that he is not overly tired, maintaining his dedication to his master. Now, Brutus promises to care for Lucius if he survives the upcoming conflict. This reveals Brutus's kind-hearted nature and sense of responsibility. Music is a symbol of peace and solace, which contrasts with the tension and chaos in Brutus's mind. This is a sleepy tune, O murderous slumber. So Brutus observes that the music is making Lucius, sleepy. Slumber is personified and is described as wielding a leaden mace like a soldier. I'll take it from thee and good boy, good night. Brutus gently takes the instrument from Lucius to let him rest. This act highlights Brutus's tenderness and care. Where I left reading, here it is, I think. Now, Brutus turns his book, showing his intellectual side. This reflects his habit of contemplating and preparation for battle. Now, this is when we see the ghost of Caesar enter. Now, here we see the introduction of a supernatural element. Please keep in mind, in Roman culture, ghosts and omens were significant, symbolizing guilt, fate, or warnings. So Brutus notices the weak flame of the taper or the candle. This could also be explained as the weak flame symbolizing Brutus's own fading resolve. Brutus initially doubts his sense, thinking the ghost is an illusion caused by fatigue. Brutus is startled and questions the ghost's identity. He mentions the phrase, makest my blood cold and my hair to stare, vividly describing his fear. Now, the ghost identifies itself as Brutus's evil spirit, symbolizing his guilt and inner conflict over Caesar's murder. Brutus demands to know the ghost's purpose, showing his courage despite his fear. The ghost predicts that Brutus will see it again at Philippi, foreshadowing Brutus's defeat and death. Brutus accepts the ghost's prophecy with stoicism, and he goes on to regain his courage, but the ghost disappears before he can question it further. Now, Brutus calls out to his attendants seeking confirmation of what he just saw. Lucius, half asleep, mistakenly thinks Brutus is talking about the musical instrument. This adds a brief moment of innocence and, of course, a little bit of humor. Brutus asks Lucius if he cried out in his sleep seeking evidence of the ghost's presence. Now, both attendants, Varro and Claudius, they deny seeing or hearing anything unusual, adding to the sense of mystery. Brutus instructs Varro and Claudius to tell Cassius to prepare for battle early in the morning, showing his focus on duty despite personal turmoil. So we see that the ghost of Caesar embodies Brutus's inner turmoil. And as we conclude Act 4, Scene 3, we see Brutus standing at crossroads of fate and guilt. The ghost of Caesar isn't just a supernatural element, it's a reflection of Brutus's inner turmoil, his conscience haunting him as he prepares for battle. So, this scene beautifully combines Shakespeare's mastery of dramatic tension with Roman ideals of Stoicism and the beliefs in omens, creating a powerful moment that builds a suspense for the climax at Philippi. Remember, the ghost's words, "Thou shalt see me at Philippi," are not just a warning but a prophecy foreshadowing the inevitable fall of Brutus. So take a moment to think, how does this encounter shape your understanding of Brutus's character, and how does it highlight the consequences of his actions? Thank you for watching, and stay tuned as we explore the intense and tragic conclusion of Julius Caesar.